Well, with this lecture, we'll be in chapter 11 and lecture number 3. We'll talk about travel in Southeast Asia. We'll talk about the countries of Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. We'll start with disputed claims. There's a very interesting discussion about transportation involving business and commodities on page 515 that include this map of disputed claims. The yellow line represents China's claim to the South China Sea region in terms of claimed territorial waters. Of course, this is a tremendous distance, and they consider this important for their defense. Meanwhile, international treaty shows 200 miles off the coast of each country is under the control of each of those countries. And so this center area in the South China Sea should be undisputed international water, and much of the territorial waters claimed by China, of course, invade into the territorial waters by international treaty claimed by Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. And of course, China has had minor skirmishes with countries like Vietnam over this boundary as well as the Philippines in 2012. Currently, China is developing some islands off of atolls and the small islands in the Spratly Island region of the South China Sea. It falls almost in the lower center part of the South China Sea international waters section. So hopefully this doesn't create any kind of further international tensions. The region is extremely important to the international trade in this area, the globalization movement of commodities from many of these globalized economic regions, from Taiwan, from Vietnam, into places like, and into Malaysia, Indonesia, into Singapore, Thailand's trade, all very important as many commodities move through the South China Sea. Often coming through the very important Strait of Malacca, even since ancient times, coming into Singapore, which is a major transportation hub, and perhaps moving on to any one of numerous countries within the South China Sea border area. In addition to trade, many people are moving around within this area. In 2011, travel and tourism industry contributed to 10.9% or over $237 billion to regional gross domestic product, and directly or indirectly accounted for 8.7% of total employment. Countries attracting the greatest regional share of international tourists from 2000 to 2011 were Malaysia, with the largest percentage, Thailand, followed by Singapore, which is a very small country, and many people go to Singapore for the vast array of international shopping that's possible there. There is a diverse mix of touristic activities in Southeast Asia. Sun and surf tourism is especially important in Thailand, in the Philippines, and along the coast of Vietnam. Cultural heritage tourism with destinations including both pre-colonial and colonial landscapes is attractive in a number of countries as well, including Cambodia, in Vietnam, and pretty much most countries in the region, with the exception of Burma/Myanmar, which has very little tourism due to its isolationist past, which may be recently potentially changing in the near future. We'll talk about that in our next lecture. While much of the travel income included in tourism is for business purposes, the growing affluence of East and Southeast Asia, middle and upper classes, is one reason that the travel has spread. Also, Southeast Asian travel times are less for people in the region than to go further places. And so this also kind of a friction of distance concept. Tourists from East Asia and Southeast Asia tend to travel closer to their own region. Source of tourism in Southeast Asia. We see the majority of the tourists in the region come from the Asian Southeast trade regions. Much of this certainly can be attributed to business travel, but as we mentioned, the growing affluence of the middle and upper classes, financial classes of the region also have seen this adding to this percentage. Japan, 5%, China, 7.1%, probably a fair amount of business travel here. Same for South Korea, fair amount of business travel, but also tourist travel as well. European Union, a lot of 10%. That's a lot of people in tourism probably, as well as business travel. India is an important trade partner through this reason, and much of that is certainly going to be business travel. USA is probably a mix as well. Singapore. This map is on page 522 of your text and shows both the country of Singapore with extensive urban areas surrounded by mountainsides. It's a city-state, not a large region. In fact, we see it's probably 25 miles from east to west and perhaps 15 to 20 miles north to south. Occupies a strategic place in the Strait of Malacca, coming into the Strait of Singapore, very ancient and important transportation route. There are important ports for transportation. As a transportation hub, the Keppel Harbor region is important, transfer point for container ships. Also here to the west are other harbors important for the transportation business within Singapore as kind of a clearinghouse for movement in the entire region. Singapore developed through FDI quite a bit of manufacturing industries, and as those industries became surpassed in terms of profit by higher value, high-tech industries, these lower value industries, manufacturing in particular, moved to parts of their trade triangle here, which includes near Singapore, places in Malaysia, as well as Indonesia. Singapore is thoroughly globalized economy. It's a regional center of banking, transportation, and service industry. It is a distinctive state. It has a population of 5.3 million people within that small area. It's a city-state. It's the smallest and most urbanized of all Southeast Asian countries. It's the only developed nation in Southeast Asia where ethnic Chinese constitute the majority of the population. It's a regional and global shipping hub, a maritime center of transportation and transportation management, ensuring the statistics and profitability and prevention of loss for transportation of commodities throughout the entire globalized transportation system. Producer services also include banking, insurance, communications, and consulting. The economy is diversified. It's the regional headquarters for many international firms. There are state planned industrial parks, especially now for high-tech industrial development that have attracted foreign direct investment, and as we said, is part of the global growth triangle between Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, probably the heart of that growth triangle. The government has a pervasive role of government, is critical to the economy and to society. It is a soft authoritarian government that helps direct placement and attraction of various industries and the removal of other industries as the economic system, as the economy improves and the level of development improves as well. So we'll move now into Malaysia and Indonesia. Here we see a map from page 523 of your text. Malaysia is both insular and peninsular. The peninsular region includes Kuala Lumpur, the capital, and probably the primate city. Singapore is on the south end of the peninsula peninsular part of Malaysia. The insular part is in the northern part of the island of Borneo and includes Sarawak and Sabah states, shared with a couple of the smaller city countries, or smaller countries, including Brunei. Here we see then below in green the country of Indonesia, many islands stretching from the island of New Guinea, the west side of New Guinea, through some of the more remote islands, Sulawesi, south into Borneo, Sumatra to the west, including Banda Aceh, where thousands of lives were lost in a tsunami in 2004. Sumatra, not as well developed. Java, highly developed. The site of the capital, Jakarta, extremely densely populated. We move on then to Bali, a unique Hindu island in the midst of what is primarily an Islamic religious country. Some of the other more rural islands moving in towards West Timor-Leste, which also is a Christian anomaly within the religious scenery of Indonesia. Malaysia is a country of 29 million people. It's a middle income industrialized country. The economy is generally based on a wide variety of electronic export, at least the most affluent aspect of its economy. It's a spatially fragmented country with West Malaysia more densely populated and East Malaysia sparsely populated, in particularly it's a site of the two states of Sarawak and Sabah, more resource extraction and agricultural type region. Since 1970s, Malaysian economy has emerged from a developing state. During this period, the period of 1970 to 1990, there was an implementation of the new economic policy that implemented changes through state-owned industries, increased economic contributions of ethnic Malays. This would be done at the expense of Chinese and Western economic interests for the benefit of the people within the country of Malaysia. They also increased government funding of roads and infrastructure improvements to expand commercial cultivation of rubber, palm oil, and coffee by native smallholder farms in the rural and frontier regions, especially in the east part of Malaysia. And they have also directed a movement towards a post-industrial economy with a multimedia super corridor. But long-term goal of spatial equity in development has not been met in Malaysia. Of Malaysia's 14 political units, only a handful have incomes above the national average, and most of these are located in the peninsular west coast core region of Kuala Lumpur, the capital and the primate city for Malaysia. as part of the economic periphery, still tied to natural resource exploitations. 3 of the 4 peninsular East Coast states, as well as Sarawak and Sabah in East Malaysia, remain relatively poor. Sabah has probably the highest poverty rate in Malaysia compared to a national average that is relatively low. And a colonial inheritance of uneven spatial distribution persists to the present day, really focusing on the development in the Kuala Lumpur area with items such as the multimedia super corridor. Indonesia is tied to resource exports. It's a developing country with problems of economically integrating the respective and far-flung archipelagos. It's the largest archipelago state. It's the largest country in Southeast Asia, the most populous country in Southeast Asia. It was enlarged considerably when the as a newly independent state, when it annexed the western half of New Guinea in 1963. It has tried to forge national unity from a diverse array of ethnic groups. It respects religious freedom, even though it's the most populous Islamic state in the world. Because of the fact that it is a version of Islam that was passed through India, it removed some of the more pervasive patriarchal aspects of Islam, and women in Indonesia have many more rights than what you would see in an Islamic country tied to Sharia law. The population is about 241 million people, with growth and distribution are major issues trying to support this wide variety and large number of islands in the region. Indonesian initiatives, poverty eradication through widespread adoption of hybrid rice and fertilizers was supported in terms of trying to improve some of the rural areas. Most of the economy is based on state-owned enterprises. Much like China, Jakarta is the national capital region, the primate city. It has attracted some export-oriented manufacturing operations, including electronic part assembly, footwear, and household appliances. If we chart the changing economic and political tensions between Java and Indonesia's outer island since the country achieved independence, there's an overreaching goal of the newly independent government in 1949 was to forge a national unity through the diversity of groups. In pursuit of a goal of national unity, the regional maritime trade language of Malay was successfully promoted as a national language. As the most populous Islamic state, still religious freedom is respected. The population is 88% Sunni Muslims. There are pockets, as we mentioned, of some other religions. Extremist groups have emerged in Indonesia, but Islam was primarily introduced from India and was modified through its passage of Hindu and Buddhist cultures Women hold prominent role in village and household economic exchange, and Indonesia does not exhibit the strong patriarchal or male-dominant culture common in other Middle Eastern Islamic states. Colonial legal systems were adopted after independence, reducing the role of Sharia law. Governments are characterized by democratic institutions, allowing for moderate dissidents, making a political form of extreme Islam less likely to emerge. Indonesia is ethnically diverse, and the government does not want to alienate the non-Muslim minority, especially the economically important Chinese, in any way. The Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s in Indonesia resulted in the meltdown of the Indonesian economy and forced the resignation of President Suharto in 1998. Regional tensions associated with economic disparities between the core and periphery reached a high level of tension during that time, although that has always existed, and those tensions continue to exist today. Since the early 2000s, political and economic reforms have begun to transform Indonesia, though. More inclusive and transparent multinational elections in a region once dominated by a single-party military government. That coupled with greater decentralization of economic decision-making so that the outer island provincial governments have more control over economic activities has ushered in a wave of optimism on the part of both Indonesians and foreign investors. Much of the country's modern history, the central government in Java has made the decisions concerning those outer island economic developments, as well as maintaining royalties earned from foreign investments in mining and plantation. This unequal economic relationship combined with the outer island resource extraction by foreign nationals is a classic example of the core benefiting at the expense of a less developed periphery. However, Jakarta still receives most of the FDI in manufacturing because of better telecommunications and transportation infrastructure relative to other locations in the country. The primacy of Jakarta is reflected in the spatial inequities of per capita GDP. Jakarta's per capita GDP is almost 4 times that of Indonesia as a whole, 5 times that of the rest of Java, and 6 times that of eastern Indonesia, the poorest region in the country. And in December 26, 2004, a tsunami in the Indian Ocean. The tsunami, of course, is a sea wave triggered by energy release from deep water earthquakes, landslides, or volcanic eruptions. As we said, this region is part of a convergence of a number of tectonic plates. An earthquake created this particular tsunami that resulted in over 300,000 deaths in 13 countries. Indonesia, northern island of Sumatra, suffered the greatest number of casualties, with almost a quarter million Indonesians deaths. Banda Aceh in northern Indonesia and Sumatra was kind of the focal point of the largest number of deaths. Low island regions were devastated. The tsunami reached as far as across the ocean to India, where another almost 20,000 people deaths were recorded. That's it for Chapter 11, Lecture 3, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thanks.